Today I'll be speaking about an NYPD detective that was on John Gotti's payroll. In 1974, William Peist officially joined the New York Police Department. However, due to massive layoffs that year, he only worked for 9 months. Out of a job, he joined the Department of Corrections, working as a chef at Rikers Island. For Peist, besides being a cop, his second lifelong dream was to cook and bake. By 1979, the NYPD was rehiring, and Peist was reinstated. He was assigned to the Public Morals Division, and it was there that he received his detective shield. During the same time, he was working as a banquet chef at the Waldorf to make extra money. I believe back then, police officers were forbidden to work out of uniform in any place that served liquor, which was called moonlighting. Tragedy would strike Peist a few years later on December 3rd, 1984. While driving on a Manhattan bridge, his car broke down, and while he was attending to it, another car slammed into him. Consequently, he lost his left foot and ankle, but in following surgeries, he would lose the rest of his left leg. Naturally, his injury had him out of work, but he would return 2 years later and was reassigned to the Intelligence Division, an elite unit within the NYPD whose main objective was monitoring organized crime activities. Peist would file a lawsuit for $75 million against the city of New York for unsafe conditions on the bridge. That lawsuit was eventually settled for $1.4 million in 1989. Nevertheless, 2 years prior to winning his case, Peist got involved with the Gambino family, and this was through his wife's cousin, Peter Mavis, who was a small-time gambler and was friends with George Helbig, a bookmaker and a Gambino associate with Gambino captain Joe Butch Carraro's crew. Apparently, Mavis was into the Gambinos for gambling and a $20,000 loan shark loan. Unable to pay the money he owed, he offered to have his cousin's husband, who worked for the Intelligence Division, provide the Gambinos information. Of course, this was music to the mob's ears. Having a police source is invaluable to them. The chain of information traveled from Peist to Mavis to Helbig to Joe Butch, who then passed it on to John Gotti. In turn, Gotti put Peist on a retainer, where at times he even suggested he be given more money. In 1990, Gotti was acquitted of assaulting a union official, John O'Connor. When he was arrested on that charge, he told the arresting officer, 3-1, I beat this charge. His confidence was not for having faith in his legal team, but conversely, because Peist was assigned to protect the jurors on that case. And instead, he supplied Gotti with the names and addresses of the jury. The FBI's Gambino Squad C-16 began to suspect Gotti had a mole following placing bugs in the apartment above the Ravenite Social Club. In a recorded conversation, Gotti was heard speaking to someone they referred to as the Grim Reaper, which turned out to be Helbig, and Gotti's heard greeting him. What's up, Brother G? Good news? Helbig responded, I brought you bad news. A following conversation between Gotti and Michael Coro, Gotti tells him, I've been told by a source that a pinch is coming. It's going to be a joint pinch, federal and state authorities. Gotti was also heard telling Helbig to give the guy enough money to buy a new set of golf clubs. The FBI listened as Gotti told Sammy Gravano, they all got a cop that's a first cousin, an uncle, or a fucking nephew. And Gravano mentioned that the guy's name was Pete, meaning Mavis. Following that conversation, the FBI placed pen registers on Helbig's phones and even cloned his beeper. The only thing they came up with was a payphone that was being used in Brooklyn. And after showing a picture of Pete Mavis to a doorman, they had him ID'd. They also pieced together that Pete Mavis and George Helbig were business partners. When they looked further into Mavis, the name Constant Peist came to surface, who happened to be Mavis's cousin, and whose husband was William Peist. Apparently, in 1975, both Mavis and the laid-off Peist helped detain 2 arson suspects. The agents were able to pull the old article up, which linked the 2 men. While investigating Peist, one of the telling signs that stood out was his constant questioning of the prosecutor's office, the FBI, and other members of law enforcement about information on the mob. He would go out of his way to meet up with cops who were working organized crime cases just to pick their brains while gathering information. Ironically, Peist even began calling Bruce Mao, the head of the Gambino Squad, to check on their investigations. The information he was passing along was devastating, such as a juror's name and address who sat on Gene Gotti's 1989 trial for narcotics. When he learned there was a bug placed in a Brooklyn parking meter outside a social club, he passed that important information along. And while the federal indictment for the Windows case was being prepared, he passed along what information he could find out as well. Although C-16 was investigating Peist, the evidence was all circumstantial at the very least. But an official complaint was made in March of 1991, resulting in Peist paying a $5,000 fine and forced to retire with a yearly pension of $24,000. Not such a big win for the Gambino squad. That is, until Sammy Gravano flipped. During one of his very first meetings with the government, Gravano confirmed William Peist was in fact the Gambino's mole. Within the following month, Peist, Helbig, and Joe Butch were all indicted for racketeering and obstruction of justice. It turns out Peist passed along such information as files on 17 state and federal investigations into Gambino family members. He even provided a list of suspects for the Castellano murder investigation and turned over names of confidential informants. He was the first member of the intelligence unit to ever be indicted for leaking information. Facing the mountain of evidence against him, Peist pled guilty on February 26, 1993, to selling secret police information to the mob, specifically John Gotti. He would plead guilty a week before his trial was to begin to one count of racketeering, which included the termination of his $24,000 a year pension. And it was that very pension that made Peist do what he did. Supposedly, he resented that the police department rejected his petition for a tax-free line-of-duty pension following his accident. In his role as a Gambino mole, Peist was making $500 a week in exchange for his information. But when the information was deemed big information, he would receive $10,000, much more than his taxed $24,000 yearly pension. Let me quickly mention the Super Thanks icon, which can be found beneath this video by clicking on the 3-dot dropdown, put there for anyone who'd like to show appreciation for videos such as this. And thank you. Peist, like many people, was under the misconception that dealing with the mob was a good thing, only to realize too late that the mob ruins lives, not make them better. William Peist destroyed his reputation with the police department and his fellow officers, lost his pension in the process, and after pleading guilty, he was sentenced in May 1993 to 7 years in prison. As for John Gotti, all the money he laid out to be one step ahead of law enforcement in the end wound up being a waste of time and money because law enforcement was 2 steps ahead of him.